Dr. Sarah Chen stared through the reinforced viewport of the Titan Research Station Alpha, watching as another methane storm raged across the orange-tinted landscape. The facility, humanity's first permanent outpost on Saturn's largest moon, had been her home for the past 8 months. As the lead xenoarchaeologist for the mission, she'd been prepared for disappointment. After all, most of their explorations had yielded nothing more than frozen methane lakes and endless dunes of hydrocarbon ice. But that was before yesterday's discovery. She pulled up the initial scan results on her tablet, the holographic display flickering in the dim light of her quarters. The structure they'd found buried beneath 20 meters of ice shouldn't exist. The geometric patterns were too perfect, too deliberate to be natural formations. And the material, their instruments couldn't even identify its composition. "Dr. Chen?" Commander Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom. "We're ready for the briefing." Sarah gathered her materials and made her way through the station's cramped corridors. The constant low hum of the environmental systems had become white noise to her now, but today it seemed different, almost like it was whispering. She shook off the thought. The isolation was obviously starting to get to her. The briefing room was already packed when she arrived. All 12 crew members were present, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The discovery had changed everything about their mission. NASA's official stance was clear: document everything, but maintain absolute secrecy until further notice. "The scan results confirm it," Sarah began, projecting the 3D model of the structure. "We're looking at an artificial construction approximately 300 meters in length. The architecture suggests it was built to house something, or someone." She paused, letting that sink in. "The dating puts it at roughly 100,000 years old." Murmurs filled the room. Dr. James Parker, their geologist, leaned forward. "That's impossible. The environmental conditions on Titan would have destroyed any standard building materials over that time span." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "Whatever this is, it was built to last. And there's something else." She switched to the next image, a close-up of what appeared to be writing etched into the structure's outer wall. "We've found what appears to be a form of communication." Commander Rodriguez studied the symbols. "Can you translate it?" "Not yet. But the patterns are definitely non-random. It's organized, structured. This wasn't created by natural processes." The commander nodded slowly. "What about access points?" "We've identified what appears to be an entrance chamber on the eastern side. The ice sheets have shifted over time, actually protecting the structure. With the right equipment, we could begin exploration within 48 hours. As if in response to her words, the lights in the briefing room flickered. Chief Engineer Torres frowned at his tablet. "Another power fluctuation. We've been having them since yesterday." "Get it checked," Rodriguez ordered. "We can't afford any equipment failures out here." He turned back to Sarah. "Assemble your team. We're going in." The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. Hours. They had to modify their surface vehicles to carry the specialized cutting equipment, and everyone underwent additional safety training. Titan's surface temperature of 179 degrees Celsius meant they had zero margin for error. Sarah couldn't sleep the night before the expedition. She kept seeing those symbols in her mind, trying to decipher their meaning. Around 300 hours she heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the station's carefully regulated environment. It was like singing, but not quite. The notes were wrong somehow, discordant in a way that made her skin crawl. She got up to investigate, following the sound down the corridor toward the communications room. But when she arrived, there was nothing. Just the usual array of equipment, screens showing their vital connection to Earth, and the ever-present hum of machinery. As she turned to leave, one of the screens caught her eye. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something in the static, a pattern similar to the symbols they'd found on the structure. But when she looked closer, it was gone. The morning of the expedition arrived with another methane storm. They had to wait 4 hours for it to pass, the tension mounting with each delay. Finally, the surface readings stabilized, and the first team prepared to move out. Sarah checked her suit one final time before stepping into the airlock. As the pressure equalized, she looked through the small window at Titan's alien landscape. The orange haze that perpetually shrouded the moon seemed darker today, more oppressive. Remember, Commander Rodriguez's voice came through her helmet comm, this is a preliminary survey only. We document everything, but touch nothing without authorization. Stay within visual range of your partners at all times. The airlock cycled and they stepped out onto the surface. Their modified crawler vehicle waited nearby, its treads specially designed to handle Titan's soft terrain. As they loaded the last of the equipment, Sarah glanced back at the station. Through one of the viewports, she saw movement, a shadow passing by. But according to the mission log, everyone assigned to the expedition was already outside. She keyed her comm. Base, this is Dr. Chen. Is anyone still inside the station? There was a brief pause before Control responded. Negative, Dr. Chen. All personnel are accounted for in the expedition team. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with Titan's frigid atmosphere. She turned back to the crawler, trying to focus on the mission ahead. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that had waited a very long time for this moment. As they drove toward the excavation site, the structure's location pinpointed by their scanners, Sarah noticed something odd about Titan's eternal orange haze. In one particular spot, directly above their destination, the clouds seemed to move differently, swirling in patterns that defied the moon's known wind currents. It almost looked like something was descending. The excavation site emerged from the orange haze like a wound in Titan's icy surface. Their cutting equipment had cleared away most of the methane ice, revealing the strange, dark material beneath. Up close, the structure's surface had an almost organic quality, smooth and slightly iridescent, with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she activated her suit's recording equipment. The symbols they'd detected in the scans were far more extensive than they'd initially believed. They covered nearly every surface, flowing in intricate patterns that made her eyes hurt if she tried to follow them for too long. Dr. Chen, Dr. Parker called out, his voice tense. You need to see this. She made her way carefully across the excavated area to where Parker stood, his lights focused on a particular section of the wall. The symbols here were different, larger, more urgent looking, and they were arranged around what appeared to be an illustration. Oh my God, Sarah whispered. The image showed a series of celestial bodies. She recognized Saturn and its rings, with Titan clearly depicted. But above them, rendered in the same otherworldly material as the rest of the structure, was something that made her blood run cold. A vast, dark shape, descending from above, its form suggesting something between cloud and creature. Base, are you getting this? Commander Rodriguez asked, his helmet lights joining theirs on the wall. Affirmative, Control responded. Uploading to central database now. Static crackled through their comms for a moment, and Sarah could have sworn she heard that strange, discordant singing again, just on the edge of perception. Let's get the entrance cleared, Rodriguez ordered, clearly trying to keep everyone focused on their tasks. Torres, how long until we can access the interior? The chief engineer was already scanning the sealed doorway they'd uncovered. The material's unlike anything I've seen, but our equipment should be able to handle it. Give me an hour. As the engineering team set up their equipment, Sarah continued documenting the symbols. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to be read in a specific order, like a warning or instructions. The more she studied them, the more certain patterns began to emerge. Control, I'm sending you a preliminary analysis, she said, transmitting data from her tablet. These markings appear to be logographic, similar to ancient Earth writing systems. But there's something else, they seem to change. Change? Rodriguez asked, moving closer to examine the wall. What do you mean? Watch this section, Sarah said, adjusting her lights. She placed her hand near one of the symbols, not touching it, but close enough to cast a shadow. The markings seemed to ripple, its lines reorganizing themselves subtly. That's not possible, Parker muttered. The material's solid. We confirmed that in the scans. Before Sarah could respond, a low vibration passed through the ground beneath their feet. Their suit's sensors registered nothing, but everyone felt it. In the distance, one of their vehicle's alarms began to sound. Torres, what's happening? Rodriguez demanded. Sir, we're getting some strange readings from the structure. The composition is shifting somehow, and there's an energy signature we didn't detect before. The vibration increased, and Sarah noticed something that turned her fear into full-blown terror. The symbols around the image of the descending shape were definitely moving now, rearranging themselves into new patterns, and they seemed to be counting down. "We need to pull back," she said, her scientific curiosity warring with an overwhelming instinct to run. "Something's happening." Rodriguez didn't argue. "All personnel fall back to the vehicles. Torres, pack it up." The commander's order was cut off by another burst of static, longer this time. When it cleared, Sarah heard something that made her freeze. Through the comm system came a series of sounds, not static, not interference, but what could only be described as language. The sounds matched the rhythm of the symbols perfectly. "Is anyone else hearing this?" Parker asked, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, their suit lights flickered and died, plunging them into Titan's twilight. The orange haze above had grown thicker, swirling in impossible patterns, and in that moment, Sarah realized what the symbols had been trying to tell them. They weren't a warning about something that had happened in the past. They were announcing something that was about to begin. Through the darkness, Sarah saw the structure's surface begin to pulse with a faint internal light. The symbols glowed with an ethereal blue luminescence, their movements now unmistakable, and from somewhere above, through Titan's dense atmosphere, came a sound that had nothing to do with their comm systems, a vast resonating tone that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. "Look!" someone shouted. "Up there!" Sarah raised her eyes to the swirling clouds above, and what she saw made her question everything she thought she knew about life in the universe. The haze was parting, revealing something that simply shouldn't exist in the empty space above Titan, and it was descending. The journey back to the research station was a blur of panic and confusion. Their vehicle's navigation systems were malfunctioning, the usually reliable quantum positioning arrays showing impossible coordinates. Only Rodriguez's experience with Titan's terrain kept them from becoming lost in the increasingly violent storm. Sarah sat in the crawler's rear compartment, frantically analyzing the footage they'd captured. The symbol's transformation had been more than just movement. They were responding to something. Each new configuration corresponded to changes in the energy readings Torres had detected. "Base, do you copy?" Rodriguez's voice was tight with tension as he tried once again to establish clear communications. The only response was that strange rhythmic sequence of sounds they'd heard at the site. Through the crawler's reinforced windows, Sarah watched the storm rage. The orange clouds above had taken on impossible formations, spiraling inward toward a central point that seemed to devour light itself, and it was getting larger. They reached the station's airlock just as their suit's oxygen reserves hit the critical mark. The emergency systems engaged automatically, cycling them through decontamination and repressurization. But something was wrong. The usual process took longer, and Sarah could have sworn she saw patterns forming in the decontamination spray, patterns that matched the symbols from the structure. Once inside, the situation wasn't much better. The station's lights pulsed erratically, and every screen and display showed cascading strings of corrupted data. "Everyone to the command center," Rodriguez ordered. "Torres, get those systems back online. Parker, help him. The rest of you, full debrief in 10 minutes. Sarah headed straight for the xenoarchaeology lab. She needed to upload her data before anything else went wrong. But when she reached for her tablet, she noticed something that made her stomach lurch. The device's screen was covered in condensation, impossible in the station's carefully regulated environment. And in that condensation, invisible patterns were being traced by an unseen hand. The debrief was chaos. Every crew member had a different story about what they'd seen at the site, but certain details remained consistent. The moving symbols, the descending shape, the voice in their comms that spoke in rhythms matching the ancient writing. "Our priority is to re-establish contact with Earth," Rodriguez announced, trying to maintain order. "Once we have communications back—" "Sir," Torres interrupted, his face pale as he stared at his diagnostic panel. "You need to see these readings." The engineering displays showed the station's power grid going haywire. Energy was flowing in impossible patterns, creating feedback loops that should have overloaded their systems. But instead of shutting down, the station seemed to be adapting. "It's the same energy signature we detected at the structure," Torres explained. It's somehow interfacing with our technology, changing it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered something from her initial analysis of the site. The symbols, she said. They weren't just writing, they were instructions. Everyone turned to look at her. Instructions for what? Parker asked. Before she could answer, every screen in the command center went dark. Then one by one they came back online, displaying the same sequence of symbols they'd seen at the structure. But now Sarah could read them. They're instructions for making contact, she whispered. The structure wasn't a building, it's a beacon. And we just activated it. The station's speakers crackled to life, emitting that same discordant singing they'd heard before. But now it was louder, clearer, and definitely coming from above. Rodriguez moved to the main viewport, his expression grim. Chen, what exactly did we contact? Sarah joined him at the window and her response died in her throat. The swirling vortex above had grown massive, dominating Titan's sky. And at its center something was taking shape, something that defied physics, biology, and every other scientific principle she knew. It moved like liquid, but existed as gas, its form constantly shifting between states of matter. Patterns rippled across its surface, the same symbols from the structure, but now they were alive, purposeful. Look at the other viewports, someone gasped. Sarah turned, and her world tilted on its axis. Through every window, at every angle, they could see the same entity. It wasn't just above them, it was around them, through them. The symbols on their screens changed again, and this time Sarah understood the message perfectly. Her hands trembled as she translated. What does it say? Rodriguez demanded. It says... Sarah swallowed hard. The transition begins. The station shuddered, metal groaning under impossible stresses. In the corridors, they could hear the environmental systems changing rhythm, matching the pulse of the entity above. And throughout the station, every reflective surface, windows, screens, even the polished metal walls, began to ripple like disturbed water. Sarah watched in horror as her own reflection in the viewport began to move independently, its movements slightly out of sync with her own. And in its eyes she saw something ancient and vast looking back at her. They had thought they were making first contact, but as the entity continued its descent, as reality itself seemed to bend around them, Sarah realized their terrible mistake. This wasn't first contact. It was a reclamation. The next 12 hours in Titan Research Station Alpha defied every law of physics Sarah had ever known. Time itself seemed to flow differently, minutes stretching into hours, then contracting into seconds. The entity's presence had transformed their carefully constructed sanctuary into something alien and wrong. Dr. Emily Torres, their resident physicist, was the first to notice the subtle changes in the station's fundamental structure. The atomic bonds in the walls are shifting, she announced during their emergency meeting. It's like reality is being rewritten at the quantum level. Sarah watched as Torres projected a holographic model of the changes. The station's molecular structure pulsed with patterns that exactly matched the symbols from the ancient structure. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. The changes weren't random. They were forming new symbols, ones that seemed to reach into her mind and whisper meanings she couldn't quite grasp. Look at this, Parker said, pointing to his tablet. He'd been monitoring the methane lakes surrounding the station. The liquid surface tension has changed. It's forming structures. The external cameras showed it clearly. The vast methane seas of Titan were no longer behaving like liquid. They were rising in impossible geometries, creating crystalline formations that stretched toward the swirling vortex above. And within those formations, something was moving. Commander Rodriguez had maintained remarkable composure, but Sarah could see the strain in his eyes. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Dr. Chen, what else have you translated? Sarah hesitated. The symbols had become easier to read, but their meanings were increasingly disturbing. It's not just a language, she explained. It's a record of transformation. The civilization that built that structure, they didn't leave Titan. They became something else. The lights flickered again, and in the momentary darkness, Sarah saw impossible colors dancing across the walls. When the power stabilized, she noticed that the room's dimensions seemed subtly wrong. Corners that should have been straight now curved in ways that hurt to look at. They merged with it, she continued, the terrible understanding finally clicking into place. The entity we contacted, it was their evolution, their transcendence. And now, it wants to do the same to us, Torres finished, her voice barely a whisper. As if in response to her words, every surface in the room began to ripple. Their own reflections moved independently again, but this time they could all see the changes happening. Their mirror images were shifting, evolving, becoming something that straddled the line between matter and energy. The station's computer system suddenly activated, screens filling with rapidly scrolling symbols. But they weren't just appearing on the displays. They were emerging from them, floating in the air like luminescent smoke. "Chen!" Rodriguez called out, his voice tight. "What are they saying?" Sarah watched the symbols dance, their meanings burning themselves into her consciousness. "It's showing us what we'll become," she said. "The entity. It's not hostile. It thinks it's helping us. Elevating us." A low humming filled the station, resonating at a frequency that made their bones vibrate. Through the viewports, they could see the vortex above had begun to descend further, its vast form now almost touching the station's outer hull. "We're picking up massive energy fluctuations," Torres reported, her hands flying over the controls. "The quantum field around the station is changing, evolving." Sarah felt it then, a presence in her mind, vast and ancient. It showed her visions of transformation, of consciousness expanded beyond the limits of physical form. She saw the civilization that had come before them, their journey from crude matter to beings of pure information and energy. The symbols around them pulsed with increasing intensity, and Sarah realized they were counting down again. But this time, she understood what they were counting toward. The entity wasn't just changing the station, it was changing space-time itself, creating a bubble of altered reality where the laws of physics no longer applied. "We need to make a decision," Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We have maybe an hour before the transformation becomes irreversible." Sarah looked at her hands, watching as the skin seemed to ripple and shift, becoming temporarily transparent before solidifying again. The entity's influence was growing stronger, its presence seeping into their very molecules. Through the windows, Titan's landscape had become unrecognizable. The methane seas had risen into vast crystalline towers that pulsed with internal light. The sky was a swirling mass of impossible colors and shapes, each one suggesting dimensions beyond human comprehension. And in the distance, at the excavation site, the ancient structure had begun to rise from the ice, its true form finally revealing itself. It wasn't just a beacon or a building, it was a gateway. A door opened long ago by beings who had chosen to evolve beyond the constraints of physical existence. Now that same door stood open for them, offering transformation or oblivion. As Sarah watched her reflection continue its independent evolution, she realized they were standing at the threshold of something that would redefine what it meant to be human. The question was, would they step through willingly, or would the entity make that choice for them? The transformation of Titan Research Station Alpha continued with terrifying rapidity. Corridors stretched into impossible geometries, walls phased between solid and liquid states, and every reflective surface showed glimpses of what they were becoming. The entity's presence had saturated every molecule of their environment, turning their once familiar home into a crucible of evolution. Sarah found herself able to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, her consciousness expanding in ways that should have driven her mad. Yet somehow her mind adapted, stretching to accommodate these new ways of seeing. Through the station's dissolving walls, she could observe the entity's true form, a vast, multidimensional intelligence that existed in states of being she previously couldn't have imagined. "The quantum readings are off the scale," Torres announced, her voice distorting as reality fluctuated around them. "The barrier between dimensions is thinning." Rodriguez had ordered everyone to gather in the main command center, though the room now bore little resemblance to its original form. The space seemed to breathe, its boundaries pulsing with symbolic patterns that wrote themselves into the air. "We need to make a choice," the commander said, his form flickering between states of matter. "The entity has made its intentions clear. Either we accept this transformation or—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the alternative. The entity wasn't malevolent. It simply operated on a level of existence where human concepts of life and physical form were primitive, limited. Through the wavering viewports, Sarah watched as the crystalline structures rising from Titan's methane seas began to merge with the swirling vortex above. The moon's entire surface was being reshaped, transformed into something that could serve as a bridge between normal space and whatever realm the entity inhabited. "Look at this," Parker called out, his voice resonating on multiple frequencies simultaneously. He had managed to establish a brief connection with Earth, and the images on his screen showed something chilling. The astronomical arrays pointed at Titan were picking up impossible readings. The moon's very position in space-time was shifting. Sarah felt the entity's presence in her mind grow stronger. It shared visions of the previous civilization's transformation, not just their physical evolution, but the expansion of their consciousness beyond the boundaries of traditional existence. She saw how they had learned to exist as patterns of pure information, transcending the need for bodies, for time, for space itself. The symbols flowing through the air coalesced into a message that burned itself into Sarah's expanding consciousness. The threshold approaches. Choice becomes convergence. "Chen!" Rodriguez called out, his form now barely holding its human shape. "What are our options?" Sarah tried to focus to maintain her human perspective, even as her mind stretched across multiple planes of reality. "The entity, it's offering us what it offered them. True transcendence, but we have to choose it, have to embrace it." A shudder ran through the station, and for a moment, reality seemed to fold in on itself. When it stabilized, they could all see that the transformation had accelerated. The boundaries between their bodies and the environment had begun to blur. Their thoughts were becoming visible as patterns of light and energy that intertwined with the entity's symbols. Through the dissolving walls of the station, Sarah could see the ancient structure in the distance. It had fully emerged from the ice now, its true form revealed. It wasn't just a gateway, it was a template, a pattern for transformation encoded into the very fabric of space-time. "It's happening," Torres gasped, her body becoming translucent as new dimensions of reality became visible through her form. "The quantum barrier is collapsing. We're—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. The choice was no longer just about their individual survival. The entity's presence had triggered a chain reaction that was reshaping Titan itself. Soon, the transformation would become irreversible. Sarah watched as her colleagues struggled with the decision, their forms flickering between states of being. Some fought against the change, trying to maintain their human shape and consciousness. Others had begun to embrace it, their minds expanding into the new dimensions of reality that the entity had revealed. Through it all, the ancient symbols continued their dance, sharing knowledge that humanity had never been meant to comprehend. Sarah saw equations that described the transformation of consciousness into energy, the conversion of matter into information, the transcendence of time itself. And in that moment, as reality continued to reshape itself around them, Sarah understood the true nature of their discovery. The ruins on Titan hadn't been left as a warning or a simple record of the past. They were an invitation, a carefully prepared pathway to the next stage of evolution. The entity's presence filled their expanding consciousness with one final message. The threshold opens. The cycle continues. Choose. As the walls of reality continued to thin, as their very existence teetered on the edge of transformation, Sarah realized that whatever choice they made would redefine not just their own future, but the very nature of human existence itself. The time had come to decide. The final moments of human consciousness within Titan Research Station Alpha were impossible to measure by any conventional means. Time had become fluid, flowing in multiple directions simultaneously as reality continued its transformation around them. Sarah watched as her colleagues made their choices. Dr. Parker was the first to fully embrace the change, his form dissolving into patterns of pure information that merged with the entity's symbolic language. Torres followed, her scientific curiosity overwhelming any fear as she transcended the boundaries of physical existence. Commander Rodriguez held out the longest, trying to maintain order, even as the very concept of human authority became meaningless in the face of cosmic evolution. But eventually, even he understood the inevitability of their transformation. Through her expanding consciousness, Sarah perceived the truth about Titan's methane seas. They weren't just lakes of liquid hydrocarbons, they were the preserved thoughts of the previous civilization, encoded into the very molecular structure of the moon. Each ripple and wave contained memories of their transformation, their transcendence from physical form to something far beyond. The entity's presence had grown to encompass the entire moon, its vast intelligence weaving new patterns into the fabric of space-time. The ancient structure, now fully emerged from the ice, pulsed with energies that defied comprehension. It served as an anchor point, a blueprint for the transformation of matter into pure consciousness. Sarah's last human thoughts were focused on the messages they'd sent to Earth, before communications became impossible. She knew that other humans would eventually come to investigate their disappearance. They would find Titan changed, the research station transformed into something that their instruments could barely detect. The final transformation began with a cascade of impossible colors that wrote themselves into the dissolving air. Sarah felt her consciousness expanding exponentially, breaking free from the constraints of her physical form. The symbols that had once seemed alien now became the natural language of her evolving mind. Through the last remnants of the station's viewports, she witnessed Titan's surface completing its metamorphosis. The crystalline structures that had risen from the methane seas merged with the swirling vortex above, creating a permanent bridge between dimensions. The moon was no longer just a satellite of Saturn. It had become a nexus point, a gateway between states of existence. The entity shared one final vision with their transcending consciousness. Countless other worlds, other civilizations, all moving through the same process of evolution. The transformation wasn't unique to Titan or humanity. It was part of a vast cosmic cycle, a natural progression that occurred throughout the universe. Their individual identities began to merge with the greater consciousness, but not in a way that destroyed who they were. Instead, they became more expanded versions of themselves, existing simultaneously across multiple planes of reality. The knowledge and experiences of the previous civilization became accessible, revealing the true history of not just Titan, but of consciousness itself in the universe. The last physical traces of Titan Research Station Alpha dissolved into patterns of pure energy and information. Where once there had been walls and corridors, now there were streams of consciousness flowing through dimensions that no human instrument could detect. The transformation was complete, but something of Sarah's human consciousness remained, preserved within the vast network of transcended minds. She understood now why NASA's previous probes had detected nothing unusual on Titan. The moon's true nature was hidden in frequencies of reality that human technology couldn't perceive, at least not until they were ready. The entity, which they now understood was both guardian and guide of this evolutionary process, began to withdraw its direct presence. It wasn't leaving, it was allowing them to adapt to their new state of existence. The symbols that had once seemed like alien writing now flowed through their consciousness as naturally as thoughts. Titan continued its orbit around Saturn, appearing unchanged to distant observers. But for those who had transcended, it had become something far more, a nexus of consciousness, a bridge between states of existence, and a beacon for others who would eventually follow the same path. The next human expedition would arrive eventually, drawn by the mystery of the lost research station. They would find the surface altered in subtle ways, detect energy patterns that defied explanation, and perhaps, if they were ready, they would begin to perceive the symbols. The same symbols that had guided Sarah and her colleagues to their transformation. For now they existed in the spaces between conventional reality. Their consciousness expanded beyond anything their human selves could have imagined. They had become part of something vast and eternal, yet remained distinctly themselves. The cycle would continue. The invitation remained open. And somewhere in the depths of Titan's transformed seas, Sarah's consciousness reached out to touch the first ripples of the next expedition's arrival. The transcendence was complete, but the story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.